Warning, this chapter contains adult content, so I have removed that section and will be recording it as a separate video for members only. If you wish to check it out, you can either read the original from the link in the descriptions or become a member so you have access to those scenes. Indomitable Heart by Renette. Chapter 3. As they awaited the arrival of Duchess Kyr'tsad and her Jedi protector, Jango escorted Obi-Wan on daily walks through Keldabe. Both wore their full armor, as many Mando'a did in Keldabe, and as none of the locals knew them by their armor, it kept them anonymous. Via private comm channel, they conversed as they walked, at first just light observations about the city and people around them. They walked along the banks of the Kalita River, watching boats ply up and down the waterway. Barges brought unrefined ore down from the distant mountains to be smelted into Beskar, and smaller craft hauled in fish for eating, fresh or drying into Gehal. For mid-meal, Jango bought them fillets that had been skewered and seared, with a bright, distinct flavor Jango called Dralaram. The spice made Obi-Wan's eyes water, but it was all but inescapable. The trick he soon learned was in eating some of the sweet yogurt easily found on street vendors' carts. Hot seemed to simply be the local flavor, and while it wasn't what Obi-Wan was used to, he had eaten far stranger things in his travels. Obi-Wan couldn't help but to stare a bit when they sat on a nearby bench to eat their seared fish. While he had known in theory that the Mando'a were a culture, not an individual race, he still hadn't expected to see so much diversity in Keldabe. The hot Mando'a included at least a dozen species other than human in their ranks, but he'd somehow not realized they were actually more limited in their makeup than the general population on Mandalore, as some species didn't incorporate well into spacefaring organizations. Around the fish seller's cart, though, Obi-Wan could easily identify at least 10 species, and there were yet more he didn't recognize. At the cart, the vendor called a greeting, and Obi-Wan saw now that while they were clearly Twi'lek, they were likely a hybrid, as their skin was a darker brown than the orangey shade prevalent on Ryloth and in the Twi'lek diaspora, and their lekug were quite short for a well-fed adult Twi'lek. "What's got you thinking so odd?" Jango asked, then took a bite of his fish. "Correcting a mental mistake," Obi-Wan said with a slight smile. "Despite reading how many species made up the Mando culture, the images in the references always show either full Beskar gam, complete with helmets, or human faces. I hadn't realized how much of that I'd internalized until just now. But just on this random little corner with a food cart, it's just as mixed as the temple refectory at mealtime." "I should hope so, given my family tree," Jango said with a smile. Obi-Wan widened his eyes curiously. "What I remember, which probably isn't everything, is that while many Mando'a appear human, most of us born in the culture are hybrids that prove humans will bed and breed with just about anyone. From what I remember, I have Twi'lek, Cathar, Zabrak, and Tong ancestry, although claiming Tong ancestry is just a way of claiming your entire family has been Mando since the beginning of time. The human genes just tend to be dominant." "You're very lucky I'm not interested in genetics research, or I'd be asking for a blood sample," Obi-Wan said, and Jango smiled. "But you never knew you had such exotic tastes," Jango teased. Obi-Wan rolled his eyes. "Not sure it counts if you look like a galactic standard human," Obi-Wan rejoined, and Jango shrugged, still smiling. "Any special advantages?" Obi-Wan had to ask after a moment. "You mean other than his handsome face?" Jango said with a laugh. Obi-Wan snorted, then tossed one of his emptied skewers at Jango's admittedly very handsome face. Jango batted the projectile aside, and they talked a little longer about the people who had settled on Mandalore, back to the time of the ancient Tong who had colonized the wild planet, founded the Mando culture, and then gone on to conquer the entire sector. Jango told Obi-Wan about the planets in the sector as only one who had visited them could. They compared the places they had been, the things they had seen. As they talked, the subjects grew closer to their hearts. Eventually, Obi-Wan talked a little about his life as a Jedi, about almost leaving, and actually leaving, the Order, and how those trials had deepened his faith in the Force. They talked about their pasts, and the futures they wanted for themselves and their people. Django and Obi-Wan walked in comfortable silence at times too, content to simply spend time together before duty called once more. The quiet didn't feel awkward between them, neither man feeling compelled to conversation. When they wanted to talk, though, they did, and breaking the silence between them was easy, as if picking up a thread that had simply been allowed to go slack, rather than drop. They were not entirely without duties while they awaited the Duchess. Both of them were in frequent contact, Obi-Wan with Dooku and the temple, Django with his people, both in Keldabe and elsewhere. Both organizations were still keeping their eyes open for Death Watch and ensuring the security of the Oyubat and surroundings in preparation for the coming summit between the leaders of the New Mandalorian and Hot Mando'a factions. The third day Obi-Wan was in Keldabe was one of the bi-weekly market days, stalls springing up in the large square in front of the Oyubat and along the famed Chartav Meshurkane. Django escorted Obi-Wan among the stalls, stopping and talking with nearly everyone they passed. Everyone, it seemed, knew and respected the Mandalore. By the time they returned to the Oyubat, Obi-Wan had several new gifts, as much due to Django's inability to say no to the shopkeepers as Obi-Wan's inability to refuse his Mandalore. A few at least Obi-Wan was able to pass on to his master. After all, Dooku needed hair clasps far more than Obi-Wan did. By the time the Duchess arrived with her protector, Obi-Wan had developed a much greater proficiency in Mando'a and a taste for the Oyubat's thick Natragal, or black ale. While Obi-Wan usually preferred hard liquors to beer, the Oyubat's Natragal was delicious. He liked it much better than the popular local liquors, Mandali and Narcolete, which tasted more or less like jet fuel, and Tihar, which varied widely in flavor and quality, or the second most popular beer, Craigie, which was utterly foul stuff in Obi-Wan's opinion. The night the Duchess arrived, Obi-Wan polished Django's Beskargam, much to Django's bemusement. Obi-Wan had done his research about Mando customs, though. Django, as the more established of them, courted Obi-Wan by gifting him things. Obi-Wan's reciprocation came in caring for Django and his possessions, polishing his armor, and checking over his weapons. The summit would start the next day, and Obi-Wan had begun to understand how very visual the Mando culture was. Presenting themselves well would be important. For the meeting between the Duchess and the Mandalore, Obi-Wan had determined it was best to be as outwardly Jedi as possible. So he had laundered the good set of tunics and tabards from his pack and polished his boots until they gleamed. A good first impression was unlikely, since he would be at Django's side, but it never hurt to make an effort. In the morning, Obi-Wan dressed with utmost care. He helped his master dress his long silver hair back from his sharp face in a neat top knot, not particularly because Dooku needed help, but because he knew the older man appreciated that quiet show of affection. In turn, Dooku neatened Obi-Wan's trailing Padawan braid. Dooku wore his usual deep brown uniform, and Obi-Wan took advantage of the opportunity to wear the more formal Padawan whites, the traditional undyed cotton uniform typically worn in temple, which he preferred to the heavier beige hemp tunics that were more practical for field work. Satisfied with his own presentation, Obi-Wan knocked at the door of Django's bedroom and entered when Django invited him in. As Obi-Wan walked in, Django shouldered on his undersuit, then his flight suit with the leg armor already attached. Obi-Wan lifted the leather harness with its attached plates of armor, arranging it over Django's chest as Django stepped into his steel-toed boots. Kneeling, Obi-Wan shot a cheeky smile up at Django, then buckled on the codpiece, then the utility belt, and attached holsters.
You know, you don't have to do this,
Django said, a laugh in his voice. Oh, I know, but isn't this much more fun? Obi-Wan returned, and Django chuckled, sliding on his gauntlets and wiggling his fingers in the gloves as Obi-Wan tied down Django's holsters. Standing, Obi-Wan took a step back, running an appraising gaze over Django. Fully armored and fully armed. Even as Obi-Wan watched, Django double-checked his blasters and slid them into his holsters. He was fully dressed for battle, even if their conflict would be with words.
Acceptable?
Django asked. Better then, Obi-Wan said with a smile, then opened the door and let Django precede him from the room out to where Dooku was waiting in the common area of the suite. Together they went down to the ground level of the hotel, where a conference room was reserved for the talks. "Mr. Fett," the Duchess greeted when they met in the corridor outside the conference room. Django nodded, ignoring the slight.
"Your Grace,"
Django said, likewise refusing her the title of Mandalore. "My advisor, Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn," Duchess Kryze introduced, sweeping her hand to indicate the tall Jedi. Long brown hair, just beginning to silver at the temples, swept past broad shoulders, encased in the usual beige tunics and tabards, although he wore dark brown breeches. He was placid, but slightly frazzled, Obi-Wan thought. Not entirely unexpected, given Kryze had been on the run for months under his protection.
"My advisor, Jedi Master Yon Dooku, and his Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi,"
Django introduced in turn. When he was introduced, Obi-Wan stepped forward and bowed over the Duchess's hand, as protocol required, brushing her thin knuckles with dry lips. He had bowed to Master Jin as well, although the older Jedi hadn't returned the motion of respect. The Duchess at least smiled a little at the polite gesture, although the expression was tense and false. She was uneasy, Obi-Wan could see, although she disguised it well. But then Death Watch had been hunting her for nearly a year. It wasn't paranoia if someone was really out to get you. Once the introductions were made, Obi-Wan led them to the reserved room, bowing them in and holding a chair for the Duchess, then serving them tea. Master Dooku had begun training Obi-Wan in the more formal tea ceremonies early in their partnership, and Obi-Wan loved the ritual and significance of each step. He used the graceful gestures and fluid motions indicative of desire for peace and prosperity, serving the Duchess and her protector first, then Django and his master, before finally sitting at Dooku's side with his own cup. A wave of warm approval washed through their bond, nearly causing Obi-Wan to blush. Ted's posturing began the negotiations. Django conceded to be addressed as Fett, with no title. The Duchess, with a little more arguing, eventually conceded to be addressed as Satine. She was haughty, Obi-Wan thought, after watching her for an hour or so. Perhaps not undeservedly. She was the undisputed leader of the New Mandalorian faction and a strident voice for peace. She was also, Obi-Wan decided after watching even longer, terrified. But that too was unsurprising. Her family had been decimated. She, her younger sister, and her infant nephew were all that remained of the once populous House Kyr'tsad. The opening talks dragged late into the evening. At midday and again at dusk, Obi-Wan quietly excused himself and brought their meals in from the kitchen, serving the elder Jedi and their charges himself. Django thanked him with a soft smile and a brush of gloved fingers across the back of Obi-Wan's hand, while Master Dooku thanked him with a burst of warm affection through their bond. Jin acted as if Obi-Wan were a serving droid rather than a sentient being, and the Duchess sniffed down her nose. Obi-Wan wondered what Jin had told her to give Duchess Satine such a low opinion of him. Master Dooku forced a recess for the day as the hour grew late, sending his former Padawan an unamused glare. Jin ignored that as well. Obi-Wan couldn't help but feel a flash of dislike for his former master. While he would accept any rudeness toward himself, as his due, for disagreeing with Jin and parting his company to help the young of Melida Dan, the disrespect of their shared master was unconscionable to Obi-Wan. Master Dooku was a superb teacher, and one of the most respected masters in the Order. He had served more than one term as a temporary member of the High Council, and Obi-Wan knew he was under consideration for a longer term in their governing body. It utterly baffled Obi-Wan that Jin would so disrespect a man who had raised and trained him. A second late meal that night was taken in their suite, Miles and Silas joining them so Django could give them a general overview of what had been discussed that day with the Duchess. They discussed the business of the clan as well, and goings-on in the wider galaxy. There were always conflicts flaring up somewhere, and for someone whose business was security, it was important for Django to know the relevant facts. Miles and Silas retired to their rooms after a mug of Shig to close the meal, and Django went to strip off his armor and shower. Obi-Wan put the trays out in the hall for the staff, then joined his master, who had begun his meditations. They came out of their communion with the Force almost in unison, and Obi-Wan poured them each another mug of Shig from the sweet kettle. They were still sipping when Jango padded out, damp and dressed only in soft, loose sleep pants. Obi-Wan watched over the top of his mug as Jango helped himself to the Shig. Jango didn't sit, just stood watching the two Jedi for a long moment. Obi-Wan cocked his head in question.
Come to bed?
Jango suggested, eyes fixed on Obi-Wan.
Tomorrow's going to be just as long as the day's been.
Obi-Wan flushed, although he thought himself in love when he fought alongside Sur'haaise on Malita Dan as a young teenager. Obi-Wan was largely inexperienced, having been kept rather busy trailing Dooku around the Outer Rim since he was 15. He'd kissed his fellow Padawan Siri-Tachi a few times and slept at her side, buried his head between her legs, and the same with Quinlan Vos, but it had never gone further, and as both Siri and Quinlan were Jedi, they both maintained a certain emotional distance in deference to their teachings.
He's not wrong. We should get our rest,
Dooku said mildly, clasping his hand on Obi-Wan's knee as he rose. Obi-Wan gaped momentarily at Dooku as the older Jedi deposited his mug in the sink, and Jango huffed a quiet breath of amusement. Are you... really? Obi-Wan asked, his voice only squeaking a little.
I doubt neither your intentions nor your age,
Dooku said.
If he tries anything you don't want, you know how to use a lightsaber.
Obi-Wan sputtered and Dooku smiled at Jango with entirely too many teeth. Jango held up his hands in the universal signal of peace, smiling slightly himself.
I ought to sleep in my own bed, just since you asked while my master was sitting right next to me.
Obi-Wan huffed finally. Jango shrugged, then finished his Shig and put his mug in the sink.
The invitation stands,
Jango said simply.
Nothing happens that you don't want.
With that, he returned to his room. Dooku watched Obi-Wan for a long moment.
I trust you,
Dooku said simply and went into his room, leaving Obi-Wan alone. Obi-Wan huffed again and had another mug of Shig. He took his time drinking it, then went to the fresher, washed up, and changed into his sleep tunic and pants. With a final huff, he crossed to Jango's room and climbed into the bed. Jango greeted him with a quiet grunt, reaching out, but again leaving their closeness up to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan took Jango's hand, but didn't shift any closer. He was unused to sharing a bed, and wasn't sure how comfortable he'd be if they were nestled close. In the morning, Obi-Wan woke as usual at dawn. But for the first time, that morning, he woke with Jango's arm around him. They had held one another over the past few days and kissed, but this, waking wrapped in Jango's strength, smelling his warm, clean scent, it was intoxicating. Obi-Wan turned into Jango and softly kissed him awake. Jango kissed back sleepily, nuzzling gently against Obi-Wan.
So, cuy'gar, energetica,
Jango greeted in his low, rumbling voice.
Gar bolish,
Now, Bandalore, Obi-Wan responded with a smile.
I need to attend to my master.
Look, Sharika, Jango murmured and let Obi-Wan slip from the bed. Obi-Wan flushed, leaning down to kiss Jango's cheek, and then he went through his morning routine, washing up and dressing, and preparing his master's things. A serving droid brought first meal from the kitchen below, delicate crepes with various sweet and savory fillings. Obi-Wan knelt at the low table, preparing their food and reading over the comm traffic, pouring a strongly scented blend of Shig imported from Concord Dawn for all three of them. Having been first at the table, Obi-Wan was the first one done, and he used the time while the others were eating to meditate briefly. When they finished, Jango returned to the negotiating table with Yan and Obi-Wan flanking him. Miles and Silas returned to the business of the clan, vetting prospective contracts, maintaining their equipment, and training the super commandos at a local drill deck. Negotiations moved slowly. While they were in the meeting room, the talks were interminable. First, Django and Satine had to agree that their people were one and the same, not hot Mando'ade and new Mandalorians, but Mando one and all. Once there was a certain amount of trust and that initial agreement was reached, Django and Satine had to work item by item through the extensive bureaucracy of the current failed government. Department by department and region by region, they worked through the jurisdictional issues. Before they even started working on the division of duties, they argued over whose maps to use, which economic and demographic data was most accurate, what geological survey or hyperlink coordinates were objectively best. They would hammer away at a single paragraph for an hour or two, then send the text to their advisors for revisions. Their advisors often suggested corrections with diametrically opposite definitions or outcomes, and more than once either Dooku or Jin called a recess for a few hours to let the two Mando cool their heads a bit. Given the nature of Mando tempers, even agreeing on the correct name of a province could take 3 sessions over 2 days, with all the attendant corrections and commentary from their aides and counselors. In the evenings, though, Obi-Wan almost didn't mind that the summit was dragging on day after day. Django took him out into Keldabe after the talks had adjourned most nights, leading him through the narrow, winding streets and showing him the quiet little tap cafes, or taking him to rousing performances of traditional Mando dancing and singing, with audience participation encouraged. When there was partnered dancing, Django would whirl Obi-Wan into his arms, and Obi-Wan grinned, following to the best of his ability, trusting Django to lead him. The summit itself was fodder for speculation in both local and galactic holo news, as the clans had been warring for years. The prospect of peace was alluring, even to the more martially minded of the Mando'ade, and stability in the sector would bring outside trade that would benefit everyone. Most of the local journalists respectfully kept their distance from Django's personal life, although more than one new Mandalorian aligned station had speculated about the fact that one of the Jedi mediators was often seen out and about with Django. There were thankfully no images. The locals took a certain pleasure in using the off-worlders' drones for target practice. Django had a bland statement published on the subject, acknowledging that the Jedi at his side were members of the clan, but also attesting to their integrity. He also pointed out that while they were clan now, they'd known one another for a matter of months. If anyone's impartiality was to be questioned, why wasn't it the Jedi who had been living hand in pocket with the Duchess for a year? Some speculation had followed, but eventually other topics drew the reporters' attentions, and it was assumed by those unable to see them together that a Jedi accompanying Django was his protection rather than his companion. Obi-Wan was more than a little pleased to be out of the spotlight once that speculation passed, although thankfully he hadn't been identified by name. It made their evening excursions into town much more enjoyable when he didn't have to worry about who might see them ducking into a shadowy alcove to share a kiss. Some nights, when they returned to the suite, Dooku was still awake, reading or meditating before turning in. Obi-Wan always blushed heatedly at his master's knowing look, but Dooku would just smile, and when they meditated together, Obi-Wan could feel his master's quiet pride in both him and in Django. It made Obi-Wan warm with affection every time, touched at his master's trust that he could become close to Django without risking attachment. In a way, though, Django's position made attachment almost a non-issue. They were both aware they had duties and obligations to others, and while they treasured one another's company, they both knew there would be long separations and times when their responsibilities had them at odds. Django would be Mandalore until death, because he would die before dishonoring his title and clan. Likewise, Obi-Wan would always be a Jedi. But they could be those things, Jedi and Mandalore, and still love one another, despite the historical antipathy between their peoples. That ability to separate duty and affection was tested in the second month of negotiations when Death Watch attacked Keldabe. Pri Vizsla, the son of the previous leader of Death Watch, had taken up his father's mantle and led what remained of their cadre in a near-suicidal attack on the city. Even those not affiliated with the hot Mando'a were more than willing to suit up in defense of their home. The hardest part of the defense was getting everyone communicating on the correct frequencies so they could coordinate with one another. The local journeyman protectors were soon linked into the hot Mando'a comm frequency, though, and took charge of organizing the other local volunteers. Obi-Wan was into his beskar gown with practiced ease within minutes after the first explosion ripped through the city. His armor plates were still unpainted, but it didn't take a genius to understand that Obi-Wan had been favored by the Mandalore with a very expensive gift. Jin sneered when Obi-Wan appeared in his beskar gown, but Obi-Wan ignored him, crossing to kneel before his Mandalore, fist pressed to heart in salute, boucher tucked under his arm. Jango smiled tightly, running his hand through Obi-Wan's short-russet hair. "Koyashi," Jango ordered gruffly. Given the strength of the command, Obi-Wan knew he meant "stay alive," rather than some of the other translations he learned. "Pirunir, sur'haaise," Obi-Wan responded with a cheeky smile, then kissed Jango's hand. Jango smiled fairly at that and nodded sharply, then tugged Obi-Wan up to kiss him deeply on the mouth. "Koyashi," Jango reiterated when they parted, more in the vein of "come back to me," this time as he gently brought their heads together. This, Obi-Wan now knew, was an incredibly intimate position between two Mando'a, pressed forehead to forehead and nose to nose, sharing life and breath between them. "Hat, Ija, Hait," Obi-Wan swore and leaned in to kiss Jango again. It was not attachment, but he wasn't going to let anyone take Jango from him. Parting, Obi-Wan slammed on his boucher and sprinted from the hotel, testing his comms as he ran. He heard Jango's voice join the comm chatter a few moments later, directing the super commandos. The distinctive roar of jetpacks screamed overhead, and Obi-Wan was sure he heard the unmistakable discharge of Jango's custom Westar 34 blasters. Toggling his HUD, Obi-Wan rapidly took in the information provided and assessed the field of battle. A low hum sounded just out of Obi-Wan's peripheral vision, but he didn't turn. It was the distinct sound of a lightsaber being engaged, and he felt no immediate increase in the level of danger around him. It wasn't the familiar presence of Master Dooku, who had likely gone to find a data suite, which meant it was Jin. Obi-Wan debated a moment, then toggled on his external speakers. "Are you not needed with the Duchess?" Obi-Wan asked. "Master Dooku is capable of defending her," Jin said dismissively, and Obi-Wan shrugged. Their shared master was more than capable, but the Duchess wasn't Dooku's responsibility. But then, from what little Obi-Wan knew of Master Jin, the man didn't seem big on responsibility. It was perhaps a judgment made in ignorance, but Jin didn't allow himself to be known well enough for a better assessment to be made. True Mandalorian signatures were already registering on Obi-Wan's HUD, and so he pitched himself down into the battle and joined in the plaza, confident he had backup if needed. People were boiling out of the buildings that ringed the square with whatever weapons they had on hand. Down the Chortav Meshurkani, the stores and stalls selling blasters were seeing a sudden dramatic uptick in business. Obi-Wan's saber was a searing blue beacon, and he grinned fairly as he took the arms off a Death Watch commando whose beskar gown had been made of true beskar. The lightsaber parted the durasteel and armor weave like flimsy blast. Obi-Wan danced and spun, reflecting blaster bolts until the Force screamed, and Obi-Wan ducked, rolling under a slice of black light. For a moment, he just stared, panting in shock. The Darksaber! He'd heard of it. Every Jedi initiate knew the stories by heart. The ancient Mando Crusaders had struck deep into the heart of the galaxy, toppling the Jedi Temple and taking the distinctive saber of Tare Vizsla as their prize, along with numerous other treasures. The Darksaber had been passed down in the lineage of House Vizsla for generations since. House Vizsla, whose head was the leader of the Death Watch faction, had taken many Jedi lives over the years with the fabled blade. Obi-Wan growled softly. Vengeance might not be the Jedi way, but Obi-Wan was hot Mando'a now as well, and the only one practiced against a saber-wielding opponent. He would protect his clan. "Darksaber, on it!" Obi-Wan warmed over the comms, and then he engaged, hoping the other hot Mando'a would stay back. In his peripheral vision, he could see the movement of enemies and the clan alike on his HUD. He ignored the information for a moment, his focus entirely on the saber wielder before him. The Mando'a bearing the Darksaber had clearly studied swordsmanship, but they just as clearly were unused to fighting with a lightsaber. The physics and mechanics of fighting with a force-imbued plasma blade were utterly unlike anything else. There was a reason Jedi learned from a very young age how to handle their weapons, and why most non-force sensitives didn't use lightsabers. It was possible, but it was a lot of work, and a Jedi would usually overpower a non-force user regardless when it came to bladed combat. Obi-Wan utilized the familiar defensives of sur'haaise at first. It was soon clear to him, though, that while his opponent was making plenty of mistakes, they were getting better as the fight went on, learning Obi-Wan's style. Obi-Wan was learning and analyzing too, though. Such was one of the strengths of the resilience form. With a sharp smile inside his bouche, Obi-Wan flowed from defensive sur'haaise into the more aggressive contention form, Makashi. It took 3 efficient parries and a sharp thrust, and Obi-Wan hit the weak spot in the Beskar gam, his blade piercing through his opponent's throat at the sternal notch. The Death Watch commando collapsed, and Obi-Wan grabbed the Darksaber as it fell, securing it at his own waist. Obi-Wan withdrew his blade and settled back into sur'haaise, deflecting blaster bolts back at the attackers. With the city rising against anyone wearing a Death Watch sigil, or even perceived supporters, the attack was soon disrupted. The high whine of a jetpack itched at Obi-Wan's hearing, and he smiled as his HUD indicated it was Jango. The Mandalore sat down at Obi-Wan's side, followed shortly by the other hot Mando'a loyalists that had been in the city. There were only about 50 of them, that being the capacity of Jango's personal Ayat gunship, Jaster's Legacy. With the city on their side, that was more than enough. Confident they were safe with the others surrounding them, Obi-Wan removed his helmet and knelt, unhooking the Darksaber from where he'd secured it on his utility belt and offering it to Jango. A sharp gasp raced through the nearest hot Mando'a, all of them recognizing the weapon even when it was powered down, and Obi-Wan felt his master's amusement from nearby. Jango pulled off his bougie, taking the saber and thumbing the controls to engage the blade. Black light jumped from the emitter, humming ominously. Jango grinned, raising the Darksaber in victory, and the true Mandalorians gave full-throated voice to their joy. Lowering the blade, Jango thumbed it back off, then held it out to Obi-Wan. "To the victor go the spoils," Jango said. "You keep what you kill." Obi-Wan unsealed his bouche and removed it. "You honor me, Mandalore." Obi-Wan accepted, taking the hilt. He could feel the strain in the crystal. It would take practice and meditation before he could truly master the Darksaber. Rumor said the blade could only be claimed by the killer of its last owner. In that, Obi-Wan had earned it fairly. But he was unshakably aligned with the light side of the Force, and the Darksaber had been used to do many evil deeds and take many Jedi lives. He would definitely need to meditate. "My blade is sworn to the welfare of the Republic and the defense of the light. May we never meet in battle." Jango grinned at that. "May we never meet in battle, Ner Jaitika." Jango echoed, voice deepening slightly on the endearment. He hauled Obi-Wan to his feet and kissed him thoroughly to a round of catcalling from his cadre. They had all already known that Jango was courting Obi-Wan, and they all supported the pairing. The Jedi Order in general might not be well regarded, but Obi-Wan and Dooku were their Jedi, and that made all the difference. Kyr'tsad, Shabuire, thought they had a chance to take Keldabe. Jango growled that night as he paced the Mandalore suite in the Oyubat. Obi-Wan, Dooku, Miles, and Silas sat on the luxurious sofas, a room service tray on the low table. "With that kid leading them, it could have been pure hubris," Miles said disdainfully, sipping at his spiced calf. Obi-Wan grimaced slightly. He didn't regret killing Pre Vizsla, but the Death Watch leader couldn't have been much older than Obi-Wan himself, at the most. He knew Mandalorians traditionally came of age at 13, and a traditionalist like Vizsla would have started combat training even younger. That still didn't make his death right. Necessary, yes, but still unfortunate, especially as any remaining members of the Death Watch faction would make a martyr of him for their cause.
We need to find out their target, Silas said, staring thoughtfully up at the ceiling. Whether they were trying for the Duchess again, trying for us again, or just generally trying to cause chaos.
Warren is working on the tech we've discovered, Miles said, naming the slicer. Warren was very good at decrypting information or piecing back together data that had been fragmented. Hopefully they'll be able to get us some new info. Django grunted, glancing over at Obi-Wan, who had changed back into Jedi tunics and tabards. Obi-Wan had meditated earlier with a Darksaber and was looking half asleep after the day's excitement.
Let's call it a night,
Django said fondly, and Silas and Miles nodded and showed themselves to their rooms. Obi-Wan blinked sleepily as they left, then yawned.
Go get cleaned up, Jessica,
he directed gently.
Time for bed.
Obi-Wan blinked again, and Dooku laughed softly.
Come along, dear one,
Jan chided and urged Obi-Wan to his feet. Once set in motion, Obi-Wan trundled off to wash up, and Jan turned back to the host.
Good night, Django. Let me know if there's anything I could do.
Django shook his head.
Obi-Wan's neutrality has been obliterated in Jin's eyes,
Django said, knowing that was his own fault, but not regretting it in the least.
The best you could do is continue to present yourself as an unbiased mediator. Oh, Qui-Gon is well aware I'm biased in this matter,
Dooku chuckled.
He is too. But we can set those biases aside for the good of the Mando'a. The difficult parts are you and the Duchess. You both believe ardently in your causes, and that makes compromise tricky.
Django laughed softly.
I'm perfectly happy to live and let live. That's the trouble. She would have us give up all that makes us who we are, or live in exile. I love my people far too much to accept that fate.
Django growled. Dooku bowed his head in acceptance. Django's stubbornness was already well known to Dooku. It was part of the reason the negotiations were ongoing.
She loves the Mando'a as well,
Dooku reminded, and Django nodded. He did not argue Satine Kryz's patriotism. It was the wisdom of her pacifism, he questioned. Disarming the Mando'a, Django thought, would only invite outsiders to lay claim to the resources of the sector, which ought to go on sustaining and advancing the Mando'a.
And yet she would leave us vulnerable,
Django said, then shook his head.
I know I need not explain it to you.
He sighed.
It's been a long day,
Dooku said with quiet understanding.
It has,
Django agreed, going to fill his mug again. He glanced to Jan, holding up the kettle in silent offering. Dooku nodded, accepting another cup of Shig. They drank quietly until Django drained his mug with a sigh.
If you hurt him,
Dooku warned when Django had finished his Shig and turned toward his room.
I'm pretty sure the entire clan would come after me,
Django said bemusedly.
I know it's been fast, but I could easily love him young. I know our lives will keep us apart at times, but that man, he's the one. Mando'a don't really believe in soulmates or perfect matches like some people do, but if I did, I'd say he's likely it.
Dooku nodded at that, then retired to his own room. Django turned out the lights and double-checked the locks, then headed to bed himself. As he finished stripping and checking over his armor, he heard the water shower turn off. Obi-Wan padded into the bedroom in the synth silk sleeping tunic Django had bought him a few days before, the shimmering green fabric bringing out the greener tones in his eyes. Django let his eyes trail down his Jedi's lithe form appreciatively. Although the cut of the tunic was modest, long-sleeved and high-necked, the hem hitting at the knee, the material was so fine it was slightly translucent. Django swept Obi-Wan into his arms, kissing him. Django? Obi-Wan asked, and Django growled softly, kissing along his lightly stubbled jaw.
Bed, Sharika,
Django ordered. Obi-Wan flushed the naked desire in Django's voice, and Django couldn't help but smile. He guided them both into bed, spooning along Obi-Wan's back. Shari, Obi-Wan murmured sleepily, tugging Django's warm arm around his waist.